Welcome to SCCI Fashion Hub 2020 from the Brayland Pavilion. Thank you for joining us. As we all know, global health precautions, quarantine measures and border closures continue to interrupt daily life. Times are uncertain and the world seems to have gone temporarily awry. At SCCI, we're trying to take adversity in our stride and creatively problem solve. Over the coming months, SCCI will broadcast a content-rich, for the most part Australia-focused, visually compelling virtual suite of conversations, all within the context of our usual hub format. Our cast of designers, makers, writers, authors, academics, theorists, gallerists, curators, museum leaders, activists and philanthropists are currently and progressively being filmed. We hope their wisdom and expertise will provide both inspiration and comfort to you at this trying time. Be well, be kind, and above all, be safe.
So at the heart of this play, in your interpretation of Hamlet, is of course gender and the fact that you have a female Hamlet. So would you like to talk about that decision to have a female Hamlet?
It feels part of my generation's responsibility that we open these plays up to as many voices as possible. And that's not just gender, that's just in a kind of diversity conversation. But one of the things that became apparent to me over the last few years is that Shakespeare's interest in masculinity often centres around misogyny, and that a lot of his male characters, when put under pressure, revert to a misogyny, either acted out or at least in language, and a deep fear and suspicion of women. Now, culturally over the last 5 years, but possibly 10 years, the idea of watching men explore that is not actually that interesting. Whereas to have a female body playing a male character exploring that is actually interesting. And so a few years ago, we did a Richard III where Kate Mulvaney played Richard as a man, but it was clearly a female body, and we made it explicit that this was a female body. And so we feel that audiences can hold those two ideas in their head. They can watch what is clearly male, but that we're not disguising the fact that the women are not pretending to be men. They're just being. And I think that's the Sarah Bernhardt thing. She really tapped into what she saw as all the feminine qualities in Hamlet in a kind of fascinating way.
Yeah, and Harriet has said herself that as a woman in that part that she can absolutely play into the sort of misogyny and some of the sexuality of the character in a more strident way and possibly a freer way than a contemporary male in the role. So
in your design approach, Harriet, of course, is in a suit, which I see as quite a constraining kind of garment. It's the cloak of civilization, perhaps, and looking good and looking very neat and compact, compared with the Laurence Olivier version with the flamboyant sleeves with the slashing and a lot of ornamentation. The suit's a very different garment.
I guess there was a few things, and part of it is the gender roles that we were exploring, in that she is a woman playing a man, but it is in no way impersonating a man, and in many ways, and it's actually been interesting seeing Harriet kind of move into the role and to slowly become Hamlet, because in many ways I've actually, thinking back to it, it's sort of been a shedding of gender. Harriet and I also talk quite a bit about the costume, about making it essentially gender neutral. So that it's not a female outfit, but a woman could wear it, and it does kind of quite consciously dress down, I guess, any sort of femininity in her, and she did cut her hair for it. And again, we kind of found a style which for the 1960s is quite a male style. But it's
and that was
not.
quite a long discussion. That was quite a robust discussion about hair too.
But there was never a time where we kind of went, we're going to put fake sideburns on.
Yeah.
Which was, that was not in the dialogue at all, because that's not the sort of way that we were playing with gender. In many ways, that she sort of creating something with her that could float across the genders. And be just more generally human than gender specific. I think that also black is very often used for Hamlet.
It's in the script. It's got that's Hamlet as a symbol is all in black, is in his inky cloak.
And then the designs happen before the rehearsals begin, but they sort of go onto paper, and then they're fine-tuned with the actors and me watching rehearsals and seeing the way that the actors are working with the characters. And as we went along, the way that she was playing her in the 1960s frame, I guess, was sort of the serious young insect character, the sort of, the dark shadow, at the back of the jazz club, silent, not saying very much. Like, that was the sort of vibe that was coming out of the way that she was working, so that we leant further into making it quite fitting. We tried many different sizes of black polo neck in different styles and arrived at one which is quite it's kind of sort of fitting and slender. And then the jacket, similarly, I guess, was actually kind of based or inspired by a jacket that the amazing Twiggy in some of the fashion shoots she did in the 1960s was wearing, kind of a pea coat, and the shoots that she did, which were sort of man styling for the woman, is how it was seen in that era, playing with gender within that as well. So again, something which was male and female, but then it closes the way that men's jackets close and all of that.
So you worked quite closely with her to develop the character through the costume?
Yeah, well, what happens, and this is usual, I've worked with Harriet before, which is incredibly useful. She was in The Miser in completely different. And the costume was pink and fluffy and enormous amounts of tulle involved. It couldn't be further apart.
Just like hyper glamorous.
And she was a completely different character. The actors are very rarely involved in the design process, just because of timelines and the way that we need to work. But knowing the people or having seen them on stage has a lot of input into the way that I approach the costume. But then as the rehearsals sort of move on, things are quite open to shifting and changing, particularly as a designer when you know the performers. It's reasonably rare that they shift a lot. More often it's a matter of fine-tuning what is there to the way that, from the discussions in the room that reveal more about the characters or the text, also just the way that the performer is working with the character. This production and also the Myers as well with Bell Shakespeare, we had the luxury of being able to tailor not all, but an awful lot of the costumes, which means we can fit them to the performers' bodies as well. So we sort of, make them absolutely from scratch. And in that we can, sit down with the performer and work on lengths and tightnesses and shapes actually on their body, so it's styled precisely to them.
Yeah, and so what's that relationship with the workroom, the people actually doing the stitching? Do you speak with them? Do you have a personal relationship?
A lot. So again, sort of ongoing collaborations are very beneficial to process. And I've worked with Rosie, who's the head of wardrobe for this production, on the Miser as well, and a few of the other cutters and makers in the room. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, we talk every day during the making process, just about.
The cutting room's right next to the rehearsal room.
Yeah, so
we go backwards and forwards.
And do you make yourself? Do you hands-on at any stage?
I don't anymore. As I said before, I used to. So I have pattern making skills and sewing skills. I was pretty much entirely maybe self-taught, so they're fluid. But and the same with because I've also worked as scenic art, but also building and in workshops, and that hands-on experience is really fantastic for the relationship I can have with the makers as well. I have an idea of how complex something is to make. I have a feeling for how you go about it, the information that you need needs to be shared with the workroom.
Yeah. How big is your team for Hamlet?
For Hamlet, our full team, it's fluid. So we had 3 people in the costume workroom the whole time, and there's sort of 3 people on the production team the whole time. The production build team grows as we get closer to the theatre, but then we work with removed workshops as well. So the set is actually built by a company off-site who has their own team. Props to be built elsewhere. For costume, we work with a main team in the room, but the tailoring, I think we had 3 different tailors who all are either working within other theatre companies but picking up freelance work, or work entirely freelance as well. So that's also nice because we can sort of share the love around Sydney. Very often sort of contemporary theatre is things bought off the shelf. So it's always really nice to be able to use the incredible craft skills that people have.
And I think there is a difference. It's visible, or you feel it as an audience member.
I think so too. You can tell when something is bespoke to the performer.
Let's jump to Ophelia. What were you trying to say with her character in this production?
It was very important in any contemporary production that she's not a victim was kind of starting point. That's actually the truth of the character. I think that over time, or there's been a certain interpretation of, is that Ophelia, because it's true she doesn't have a lot of agency, however, within what agency she does have, she has an awful lot of self-control and an extraordinary amount of empathy.
And her dress, that beautiful yellow dress, why did you choose that colour?
I think choosing yellow was just a little bit instinctive. There wasn't, there was no particular metaphor in the yellow. We were very clear, or I was very clear that we wanted her to have a strong look, that she wasn't a sort of a shrinking flower at any point, that she did have a sense of fun to her, and that she was very clearly an individual who was not too outrageous. That it's a fairly conservatively cut dress. It leans into the 1960s fun, but it's still not over the top. That she was trying to fit in within the court system, but that she not a character who receded into the background at all. I mean, part of choosing colours for a production, any production for me, is about the palette, the overall palette on stage as well. So sort of putting together, and plays are amazing. Pre-written plays are incredible because you know who's going to be on stage at the same time. And there's a bit of tweaking as it goes along, but you can have a picture in your mind of what's going to sit together at any one point.
I think that's one of Anne's real skills, is the palette is pretty tight.
Yes.
And I'm not sure the audience would realise how tight it is, in fact, but there's echoes, that Ophelia's dress is echoed in Claudius's tie. Very, very quietly, but there's one scene where you really see it, and I didn't see it until we got into the theatre. I hadn't clocked it. That's what Anna was doing, but there's little echoes and vibrations going on between the colours all the time that I think is just beautiful.
The other choice which is interesting with the Ophelia costume is traditionally, or most often in the last 100 years probably, there's a disintegration of her costume as the play goes along. There's very often a directorial or designer decision that when she returns for the handing out the flowers and the sort of the scenes of descent, that very often she becomes more undressed and her costume kind of breaks down, and there's a whole stack of decisions about, as you say, how much of a victim she becomes within it. And a kind
of sexualised victim too, that often it's underwear or something, that it's often got a kind of something really
something else going on
to try and demonstrate, because in that scene she is quite she does speak in a lot of sexual language that really freaks everybody out.
Yes.
But we were interested in, Anna said to me when we were talking, I was like, what are we going to do in the scene? And Anna said to me this brilliant thing about often female characters, their emotional, costume is used to show emotional states, and that we don't want to do that. And so what I think's happened is that the scene is clearer. What she says is clearer because we don't try and show it in any other way. She looks the same as she did in the first scene, but she's a very different person, and they're frightened of her because she's now speaking in a way that young women should not be speaking. And I think that was a brilliant decision, and I think it's really helped.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I've observed it in other productions as well, but very often the female characters' costumes are changed to convey an emotional state in a way that male costumes are not. And this was a really great choice. It's amazing to watch the way that she, as an actor and as a character, shifts, and that she doesn't need a costume change to do that at all.
But it really pushed us, I think, on the floor. I think it pushed us on the floor because it's just what Sophie does has to display where her character now is. We're not going to do anything. And I thought that was great. Really, really interesting because it makes you go, so why are they frightened of her? Why do they think she's mad? What's happened to her mind? Like all these, so we had to really interrogate those things because we weren't going to show them.
Let's talk about the sets and the interaction between the costumes and the sets, because it's a very distinctive set, and there's snow involved.
There is.
Indoors. How can this be? Why is it snowing indoors in the living room?
Yeah. It's not real. They're pretending.
It's not real.
They're pretending. It's a play.
I guess the idea from the snow also came quite early on. We looked a lot at images of amazing sort of Danish design huts in, winter landscapes, very often sort of this very clear shape, which we've used in the production, and that there are these beautiful little warm nooks surrounded by a very constantly foreboding and frightening landscape. So a sense of hearth and home, but outside it and around it, constantly vibrating with a level of threat. And then within Hamlet, of course, the threat isn't just outside the home. The threat is inside the home as well. So it's sort of having this frame, but then allowing that to be very porous, as porous as just using a simple sort of outline of the house. And what was amazing in rehearsals then was that very quickly Peter and the actors moved with that porousness, and indoors and outdoors within the first 30 seconds of action cross over each other, and people move through the house and are in an outside scene on the battlements, but the interior scene's still running. And then at the same time we were looking from the beginning of how the idea of the ghost would manifest, because that is one of the theatrical challenges of the play. So the first time the snow enters the theatrical space is the scene where Hamlet and the ghost sit down and speak for the first time. So the ghost has been in the background and is talked about and moves through and is an undercurrent in the space. But when Hamlet actually meets the ghost, who is the ghost of his father, there is a schism in the world, in Hamlet's world, and the whole story and the landscape shifts with that. So that's the moment where we introduce snow, and given that it is in some ways a supernatural phenomena, and I guess particularly playing with Nordic, where there's so much of the supernatural tradition is about the landscape and the beasts that dwell within the landscape and are a constant presence there. There was kind of no question about why it wouldn't snow in the house. It was kind of course, and that's where the snow starts.
It does start in the house within the room. There's a kind of room within a room, and it started. And in fact, by the time we got to the theatre, we were also lighting it like it was inside. Yeah. So it was snowing in what we had already associated with being inside as opposed to outside. The way we thought about it is that the ghost actually takes him back to a memory. That scene, we light it and we've made it like a memory.
Can you talk about how the ghost is costumed, please?
The costume for the ghost is quite a simple suit. There's I did feel sorry for some of the male characters in the because suits were a bit of a thing in the early 1960s. The suit is quite light grey, which actually was because of the idea of Super 8 projection, and that the fabric that we use for his suit actually has a slightly kind of pixelated feel to it as well. Yep. So it meant that him in his suit could meld into the set backdrop, which is a sort of printed fabric, and then also we project quite a lot of kind of film grain. Or Laura Turner, was the amazing filmmaker, projects film grain over the whole set quite a lot, and the ghost, as he moves in the early scenes, because of the costume that he wears, that film grain kind of reads as well on him as well. So he, leading into him causing the snow later on, is kind of melded with the landscape from the outset of the play as well.
Describe the relationship you both have together, the creative collaborations that you work on. Do you have a shared vision? Do you bring your own visions to this partnership?
I've known Anna's work for a long, long time. And I think it's just an accident that we hadn't worked together, but it's lovely because we would be what you would describe as mid-career, if you're being generous. Otherwise, we're a little more senior, and so to have a new collaboration is actually quite rare. Like often you've been working with the same group of people or something. So I've been really enjoying working with Anna, particularly because I think, this may not be right, Anna, but I think that the work we do together is probably on the more conservative end of the stuff that you do. Would that be fair?
A smaller proportion of my work is with existing plays, let alone plays which are not Australian and not from this century. Yeah. So if that means conservative, I'm not sure. But it's certainly more
traditional.
Traditionally. It's a more traditional setup with a beginning script rather than something which evolves on the floor, which is interesting from my point of view. I'm particularly interested in the way that audiences see Shakespeare, because it is a repeated form. So in many ways it does remain contemporary, but it is kind of the centre of kind of the sort of quotational theatre in many ways. Like whenever you put on Hamlet, you're referencing, within the audience's heads, is referencing all of the Hamlets that they've seen before, and there's familiar text and there's familiar lines. So it's a very complex form in the modern setting.
Certainly sitting in an audience is amazing because for every line that you remember, there's one that you didn't know was from Hamlet or you'd forgotten was from Hamlet. Yep. So sitting in the audience is sort of trippy because people are constantly going, oh, all the way through it. Like it is a strange, you're right, it's a weird sort of, everything's a quotation in a way, but that's exacerbated because Shakespeare is so meta-theatrical, that Shakespeare is working out a new form, that the theatre, the modern, what we call early modern theatre is still relatively new when Shakespeare's writing, and so they're working out what it means, like what is this form, how does the theatre work? And he seemed to explore it by making everything meta-theatrical. So the idea of acting in life is explored on stage. Yes. And Hamlet being the most self-referential in a way, that Hamlet is kind of a play about playing, about plays, really, and literally has a play within it, right at the centre of it. Halfway through the play, they put on a play. And so when we are designing, I think that's fascinating, and certainly was for the way we approach this, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the type of other contemporary work which I do is often quite meta-theatrical and conscious of itself as a performance in the room and conscious of the presence of the audience. The sort of theatre that I rarely work in and connect to less is the strict fourth wall where we're pretending that I'm 100% pretending that I'm in one world as a performer, if I was one, and the audience is in a completely different. That separation of make believe is something that I'm less interested in than what contemporary theatre does and what Shakespeare does. It's very conscious of the audience. There's a lot of direct address. There's a lot of sort of self-referential performance making in a complex way.
He kind of flips backwards and forwards, doesn't he? Like he shows up that he's aware of where the audience is by then going back into something that's completely self-contained and has a very clear fourth wall. and then he breaks it
Yeah,
again.
yeah.
And
Then
keeps
sort
going
of comes
backwards
out
and
of it with a
forwards.
sly wink almost.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, he likes jolting changes to sort of like wake up.
Yep. That's right.
We've moved, and then we'll let's look into that initial action from a different place, perhaps.
Exactly, that's very well put. That's exactly right. And tonally keeps shifting. And so for the actor, it's one of the most challenging things is that the gear shifts are so strong that a lot of them, the clutch is broken, where it just graunches into something over there, and the audience doesn't notice that. In fact, that's why the audience thinks the characters are real or finds them so believable, because they have such massive shifts, which of course we do in life. But often in drama, those things are smoothed out. The dramaturgy is about smoothing things out and looking at causation and A plus B equals. Whereas Shakespeare, it's not at all like that. It just chung, 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 chung.
I think he's really a man for our times, isn't it?
Yeah.
Incredibly turbulent political times in his lifetime, and the theatre that he wrote was absolutely absorbing all of that, and we're right in the right place for that to be very relevant at the moment.
That's right. That's right. Even the plays that don't look like they're political, they're all political. They're all political, and they're all domestic.
So let's have a look at how you two approached each other then to work together. What process did that involve? You work on Miser. How did you know about Anna first?
So I lived in Melbourne for a long time. I only moved back to Sydney because John Bell said, come and work with me and then eventually take over the company. I lived in Melbourne very happily. But I was down the road at the Melbourne Theatre Company, and Anna was at Malthouse Theatre for a long time. So I saw 3 or 4 of your projects every year for quite a long span. And then I moved to Sydney, and had you already moved? Maybe you'd already moved, or about the same time we found
probably.
ourselves in Sydney, and I just thought it would be interesting. I didn't necessarily recognise myself in Anna's work, but I'm really interested in somebody taking me somewhere different. I like to cast and work with people where I don't know what will happen. I think sometimes people go, I really want to see this actor play that role because I know what they'll do. I'm not interested in that. I want to see somebody play it because I don't know what they'll do. And similarly with Anna's work, is I had really no idea what the two of us would make, what we'd end up making. And so I thought that's reason enough to give it a shot.
Can I ask you both your pathways to where you are today? What inspired you to set foot on this track and end up here? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Gosh, it's a long and winding journey. But it's interesting once you grow up a little bit and look back. It's also something which has always been there. So I was definitely involved in, writing, directing, acting in drama at school, and also within all of that designing as well at the same time. And I guess it sort of slowly fell into place. I actually started off definitely making my own work, trained not as a designer, but in production at the VCA in Melbourne, and then launched forth from then. I've never really done anything else, but I've been involved in every aspect of it. I started designing small shows straight away, but also worked as a scenic artist and a puppet maker and a mask maker and a costume maker as well. And then slowly the design part of that grew, I guess. Yeah, so then it just sort of shifted and grew from there, I guess. And then I did move back a while ago now, probably 15 or so, 16 years ago, back into still designing, because I'm very much a collaborator, and like Peter kind of get a lot out of working with other people's ideas and sort of nutting through them. Spinning them out into something, but also sort of directing and making my own work, which is a bit more installation based. They're often long form performances, and then that's also led into installation work as well.
And it's really rich sort of set of experiences that all feed across your disciplines.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel really lucky to have worked with so many different people from different backgrounds, and I've worked internationally a bit as well, so now sort of working cross-culturally is incredibly enriching, and being able to discover new things about the way that people think and work and speak differently. but more importantly, probably the similarities and links between all of us.
Yeah. And Peter, you're another Melbourneian, as you've said.
Well,
originally.
I was born in Melbourne, but I'm actually a Kiwi, if you hadn't heard on me. I grew up in New Zealand, and one of the reasons that I've always loved Bell is that I grew up in Christchurch, which was a relatively small city in the 70s and 80s, and the idea of the theatre wasn't really on my radar. I was doing things at school, and there was one theatre with a very loyal following that we used to go to, but I couldn't quite see myself in that. And so the idea of a career didn't happen really. I went to university in Auckland, and I wasn't really enjoying university very much. I had a very romantic idea of it. I thought that university would be like Brideshead Revisited.
About to say.
Yeah, I
the gilly flowers outside your window.
That's right. I thought it would mostly be coffee and cigarettes and then wine. But it wasn't, and particularly at that time because the fees came in and everyone was getting a degree and getting out. But where I did find my Brideshead vision was in the theatre, in the university theatre club, basically, and that's where I found the discussions that I was after, people talking about interesting things, and that was a revelation to me, and also I discovered very young, because I started directing at 19, but my interest was I really wanted to be a painter and I wanted to be a musician, and there were all these things that came together as a director that I got to work with people who were better than me in all the disciplines that I was interested in. Then I went to NIDA and did directing, and then the kind of career sort of started to unfold. But John Bell was one of the first people to give me a gig straight out of NIDA. So I've always had an affinity with the company, and even though I've worked for most companies in Australia over the years and in New Zealand, I've always kept coming back to Bell Shakespeare, and so when he rang me 10 years ago now, it felt natural that this would be my home and this is where I'd be.
It's also developed as a company a reputation for modernising costumes from the Elizabethan originals, and translating the plays into a more contemporary context. Sometimes that's the 1920s perhaps, or 1960s, as in Hamlet's case. Is that correct to say that that's one of the key missions of the Bell Shakespeare Company, to bring it out of the Elizabethan context?
Yes, absolutely. And really that's been John's mission since he was in his 20s, that when he came back, he was at the RSC in his 20s, and in fact both John's daughters were born in Stratford-upon-Avon, that he was working with the RSC through an incredible period. But when he returned to Australia in 1969 and 1970 to start the Nimrod, they were doing Shakespeare and New Australian work. But the idea was always that the Shakespeare should be contemporary and should be Australian and should be in an Australian voice. That's what that's what the mission should be. That we shouldn't, because of course he grew up when people were just touring English actors and English productions out here, and there was no kind of homegrown theatre, and so he was adamant that be, and so that continued all the way through Nimrod and then into Bell Shakespeare. And so I would suggest, off the top of my head, I would suggest that at least 90% of the productions are absolutely contemporary. I think the idea of period is actually not very Bell Shakespeare. That this particular production is a slight outlier, that we've put it in a period.
And Anna, has that been the way you've seen things from the time that you've been watching Bell?
I think how I saw it was definitely that it was a contemporary Shakespeare company and that it wasn't interested in presenting historic documents, but the framing of it was whatever suited the concept behind the sort of directorial and design concept behind the production.
So as I say, this one's slightly odd for both of us to do that. Although I've done much more of it than Anna, but within naturalism. All the kind of naturalism from overseas that I did at Melbourne Theatre Company often was set in periods, but I've always felt that that's because I did so much of that my work in the Shakespeare space was definitely not going to be any of that. We did embark on setting it in a period as a kind of thought experiment in a lot of ways, and I'm very pleased with it. I found the whole thing absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, it was very interesting. Yeah, as Peter says, it's not something which I normally do either. I think my work very often references periods, but it's never precise to them. It sort of takes broadly 18th century stroke, or, broadly this is a bit of a feel, and it has to do with the, politics that we want to play with, or a certain mood, a gesture towards that. So this was really interesting to go kind of deeply into the detail of a period rather than a sort of a look which the audience kind of gets that it's 1960s, but it's not as precise. Yeah, so for me it was a really interesting. The precision of doing it, and the precision of this whole production, actually. Sort of, we kind of stayed in the early 60s before it was sort of the, the bubblings of the revolution rather than when the revolution had really taken place. So one of Pete's strong sorts from the beginning, and the casting of the production was that the younger characters in the production are actually quite young. That often doesn't happen. Hamlet is often played by someone much older than than what Shakespeare was intending. So we wanted to sort of capture that feeling that the youth, who are costumed in quite bright colours compared to the older generation, and a little bit more, not moving into the sort of really rad 60s era, but certainly a bit more, hipper and groovier.
Yeah, skirts a little
for the
shorter.
time, that they were this kind of bubbling revolution. But the older generation, by putting it in the early 60s, meant that we could refer them back to the 1950s a little bit more. So there's still quite a conservative look to the way that they're dressed, and there's a sort of holding on to tradition.
I think one of the things that has been uppermost in probably all our minds is how important the arts are for creating not just work across an industry, but also creates communities of people who are the audience. And Bell Shakespeare's been present in people's life for quite some time. It's a generational thing, and you have audiences who are very loyal to going to each Bell Shakespeare production, and they might like it or they might loathe it, but what is excellent is that they think about it and they are vociferous about their opinions. And you often hear, are they wearing suits, or why they're in uniforms, or why they... But people want to go and they want to experience that stimulation. In a sense, they want to be jolted out of their traditional view.
Yes, mostly. People are very proprietorial about Shakespeare. Shakespeare's very personal to people. And of course, because half our work is in education, there's a generation of people we've been to their school.
Yes.
Which also creates a deep connection.
Well, it's been a wonderful conversation, and there's all kinds of different levels of collaboration that we've explored to bring all of this together to make a very, very relevant reading of Hamlet. Thank you very much.
Thank you.